metaphor in Chinese. If you want something very academic, and I don't want to put you to sleep, but if you're writing a term paper for one of your professors and you're talking about Confucianism, or you're talking about cultural comparison, there's a Swiss linguist named Ferdinand de Saussure, who lived at the turn of the last century, not the century, but the last century. And he makes a distinction between langue and parole. Langue is every cultural tradition produces its own set of terms, its own conceptual structure, its own way of thinking about the world, its own way of organizing the human experience. And so these terms really belong to that tradition. And you can't translate them into another language. You can't say "e" in English, and you can't say it in German either. That "e" is Chinese and it belongs to China. That's their vocabulary for talking about their human experience. I come from Hawaii. We have aloha, we have mahalo, we have all of these different Hawaiian terms that belong to the Hawaiian people. And ohana, you know, that define the spirit of Hawaii, that this belongs to the host population, the host culture. So we don't have those terms. But parole is the power of a natural language to say anything we want. We might not know what "e" is in Chinese, but English will enable us to talk about "e" and get really clear on it. In Chinese, they don't have a concept of a transcendent God, a concept of an Abrahamic God. That's not part of the Chinese tradition, and so they give it different terms: Tianzhu, Shangdi. You know, going back into a Chinese past. They don't have a concept of God, but we can speak Chinese, and we can get really clear on what Abrahamic religions think this concept of an independent creator God is all about. And so the power of the natural language to get clear on culture means that as different cultures, we can speak to each other and we can find common ground, we can understand each other. And that's very important. It's not that they have their language, we have our language, and we can't talk to each other. So that's the point made. Now, what I want to do is I want to try to give you a way of understanding this concept of person, this relationally constituted conception of person. The argument that I want to make is that in this Confucian tradition, a person is like an onion, where if you peel away the roles that constitute a person, there's nothing in the middle. There's no soul. There's no self. There's no character. There's no person. You know, there's not some kind of agency within that person that grounds it. That belongs to a classical Greek tradition that has a notion of substance. And so this expression, like when we look at Buddhism, you talk about no self. In Confucianism too, a person is defined in terms of what they do, not as a human being, something that they are essentially. Okay? So what I want to do is I want to take an element in Chinese medicine, and I want to try to use it as a metaphor for what they mean by a concept of person. You have a heart-mind. Like in this Chinese world, we don't separate the mind and the heart, thinking and feeling. In the Chinese world, they both reside in the same place, in this heart-mind. And so physiologically, like if I were to isolate the heart-mind for 30 seconds, it would be a dead piece of meat. That the heart-mind is something that belongs to this organism, and if it is functioning properly in terms of its relationship with the different parts of the body, when the Chinese doctor is listening to the way in which these different elements are relating to it, the Chinese doctor is not taking a pulse, the Chinese doctor is listening to the body and the way in which the different elements are interacting with each other. And if everything is moving, it's not obstructed, it's not stagnating, well then physically, internally, the inner landscape is pretty good. But the outer landscape is essential. That you can't function as an organism without the sunshine, without the air, without the nutrition that comes from outside. And so when you're finished talking about this heart-mind in terms of it as a physiological element, you're talking about the whole cosmos. That this heart-mind is a focus of relationships that goes out to the furthest corners of the cosmos. But the heart mind is not simply physiological. It's also thinking and feeling. And so in my relationships with colleagues and family and friends, if the relationships are really working well, if everybody happy, then I'm a healthy sociological, psychological human being. And so the heart mind is really, a person is a focus of relationships that reaches out to the furthest corners of the world. And if you say, well, what is the heart mind in itself? 这个心本身是什么东西? That is not a question that you're going to ask. That the mind, the heart mind, is simply the aggregate of the relationships that constitute it, that located in the world. It's not something that has some kind of essential identity. So, and that's the answer to this problem of self. That a person is a narrative self, not something that is a human being. You're a human becoming. How are you doing the roles and relationships that constitute you as a human being? And this idea of xiao, in this classic of family reverence, it says, it is family reverence that is the root of excellence, and whence education itself is born. That education in this Confucian world begins with xiao. When you talk about becoming educated, it's not about books, it's not about tests, it's not about a BA or an MA or a PhD. That being educated in this world has to do with educating yourself in the way in which you are capable of being consummate in the communities in which you reside. And that requires a certain kind of cognitive intelligence and so on, that what you learn in school is important. It gives you a vocabulary, it gives you analogies, it gives you correlations, but being educated in this Confucian world has to do with what quality of narrative, what is the virtuosity of the relationships that you have with other people in the world. This term, the term xiao, is constituted by lao, which means an old person, and by zi, which means a young person. And so when we look at the oracle bones, we're going to talk about these bones in a minute. See how our time is going. Good. If you want to have a chance to have a conversation. When we look at the term lao on the oracle bones, the earliest form of Chinese writing, you've got an old man with hair like Einstein, leaning on a cane. Now, and so that becomes stylized. The cane becomes stylized, so it looks like this character here. This is the modern Chinese character. But the character for xiao is the same Einstein guy with the hair, but instead of leaning on a cane, he's leaning on the next generation. And so xiao has to do with intergenerational respect and pleasure. And that takes me to the question that I want to look at, and that is to ask this question, what is Confucianism? Because Confucianism has everything to do with the way that we move from generation to generation. We call it Confucianism. This is a term that emerges when the Jesuit missionaries go to China and they want to find a category that is comparable to Christianity. So Christianity is based on the life and the teachings of Jesus Christ. Confucianism must be something that's based on the life and teachings of Confucius. In Chinese, that's not what we say. In Chinese, we talk about ru. That ru shui, the word for Confucianism, the ru are a class of people that go back to the earliest periods. They go back into the Shang Dynasty 1,000 years before Confucius comes along. And what they are is they're a class of literati. They're a class of intellectuals who are responsible for inheriting the culture from the people who come before, for using that culture to respond to the problems of the day, and then passing it on to the next generation and recommending to that generation that they do the same. Ren neng hong dao, fei dao hong ren. It's the human being that broadens the way, not the way that broadens the human being. That this notion of ru is that each generation has the responsibility of taking the culture from the generation that came before using it to make their lives better, using it to refine their lives, and then passing it on to the generation that follows them. So this notion of ru, it really has, like the associations you have in the Chinese tradition, like in English we talk about the gentry, the gentlefolk, ladies and gentlemen. This is kind of an elite status. That's the kind of people that the ru are in this Confucian tradition. And just like us, like in my library, I have Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism. And these ru are not necessarily restricted to a certain set of texts. These are people who inherit the tradition broadly and use it in order to address the issues of today. Now, when we go back to the Shang Dynasty, the Shang people are the people who are responsible for this. This is a gu. It's a bronze vessel. It's a religious vessel. And what this vessel is iconic. There's a very interesting kind of a distinction you can make between an icon and an artifact. An icon is somebody who's Catholic, who inherited a crucifix from their grandmother that's made of gold. And it's something that's been in the family for a long time. And it really is, it is part of the religious life of this young woman who's got this crucifix. And if you say to her, how much is your crucifix worth? She would say, you know, it's not worth anything, you know. And you say, well, it's gold, you know, look at the price of gold today, you know. She'd say, no, this is my crucifix, you know. This is iconic in her life. It represents her lived religiosity. But if you're not a Catholic, and it's and you're not particularly religious, then it's an artifact. It's a piece of gold that maybe looks nice, but it's not doesn't have that kind of lived value. In the world, this is in the Freer Gallery in Washington, and it's become an artifact. But if you take it back into the Shang Dynasty, the person who owned that was one of the social, political, religious leaders of that community. The person who owned that was responsible for communicating with the ancestors, pouring a libation to call the ancestors to council. A person who owned that had prestige and power within the world in which they lived. All of that is gone, and we see it. When I saw this, it's the cover of one of the books that I did. When I saw this, my jaw dropped, and I couldn't speak for 3 days. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful, but for me, it's an artifact. It's not an icon. So these Shang people, writing on bones, you know, these are the oracle bones that take us back to 1,500 years before the Common Era, where on these bones, with the Shang people communicating with the ancestors, with the Ru communicating with the ancestors, asking them questions, what do we do? Should we go to battle? Are we going to have a decent harvest? That on these bones there's 3,000 characters. An educated Chinese today can maybe read 4,000 characters, maybe write 3,000 characters. On these bones you have 3,000 characters, a hugely sophisticated language already at this point in time. And it's the magnitude, like these bronzes were produced. I know people have to go to class, so if you have to go to class, away you go. But I'm gonna be finished in just a minute, and then we're gonna have a conversation. These bronzes that were produced in this period were the aestheticization of the life of the culture. That This is a very famous painting in the Chinese tradition from the Tang Dynasty. And it really has to do with this idea that exemplary persons are not functionaries. Now, what it means to become exemplary as a human being doesn't have to do with skills. It has to do with the quality of your engagement with other people in the world. It has to do with the virtuosity that you're able to express in the way in which you deal with other people. Some people read this as exemplary persons do not use Facebook or do not use email, but that's not what it means. That's not what it meant in ancient China. It meant that if you want to be a great engineer, certainly you have to know some mathematics. You have to know calculations and so on. But at the end of the day, it's all about what quality of a person you are and how you're able to lead other people in establishing an engineering firm. How are you able to communicate with customers and other people? It has to do with the quality of your person. And so that's where we want to go. This idea of personal articulation occurs, and this is where education comes in. You articulate yourself through literature. You become civilized through illumination, using this articulation. Culture has to do with the way in which you're transformed in the process of being educated. It has to do with the text. It has to do with the pattern of the human experience. And this is where we want to go. There's a philosopher named Hilary Putnam at Harvard who says this. Now listen carefully to this, because it's not easy to understand. That our language and our mind penetrate so deeply into experience that the idea of ever being able to map experience independent of our mind and our language is quite impossible. That experience is something that we do in the world, and that's the real world. The real world is not an objective world that stands independent of our experience. The real world is the world as we experience it, And so what he's really saying is he's saying that if you want to talk about reality, reality is not something outside of ordinary human experience. That's what Confucianism is about. Confucianism is about taking the way in which we theorize the human experience, bringing it back to the ordinary, the everyday, family, friendship, teachers and students, governance, the things that are important in the human life, and then looking at how our way of thinking about experience makes that experience better. That's the Confucian tradition. And the difference between the Confucian tradition and Hilary Putnam is Hilary Putnam belongs to the 20th century Western philosophical tradition where we talk about mind and language. But in the Chinese tradition, they talk about body and they talk about roles and relationships. But they're saying the same thing. That think about how, as you're growing up, as we move from generation to generation, we embody the generation that went before. Yesterday at Kennesaw, I told the story of when I first got married. And my wife is Japanese, Japanese Canadian, Japanese American. Now she's Japanese American. And we went to their house, and they lived out in the country, and you had the council of aunties that would all sit around the kitchen table and talk about stuff and laugh and talk about family matters and so on. And then they would make a gochiso. They would make dinner, for everybody. And one day, one of the aunties said to the council, one of the cousins was going to marry a doctor, and that's great for the family. And so my wife was sitting there, and she says, "Roger's a doctor." And they looked at each other and they said, "No, a real doctor." But now, at this age, all of the aunties are gone. There's one auntie, Auntie Wendy is the only one left. The council of aunties is no more. But all of the cousins, my wife and all of them, they sit around the kitchen table, they talk story, they make the same chow mein, you know. They have the same laughter and they have the same, you know, sense of humor, the same accent, they make the same mistakes in English, you know, that their mothers did. That what you have from generation to, think about you. You shave in the morning and you look in the mirror and you see your mother or you see your uncle, you know, that physically we pass the world on from generation to generation where you embody. And embodying is not simple. In Chinese, you have first one way of thinking about body. This is the term that they use in simplified Chinese, where the body is the root of the human experience. So this is the root, and the tree and the root grow together. In Japanese, you say that anybody who is over 30 is responsible for their face. Anybody who's over 30 is responsible for their face. Have you ever seen an ugly child? Where did these ugly people come from? that your face is the outside of an inside. That the way you live your life is written in your face. I mean, this is the understanding that we grow our bodies. And so there's a sense in which our narrative as human beings, the canopy of the tree is revealed in the body itself, in the root of the body.